Hi folks, welcome to the last week of this short 5-week summer session in Music 101. I told you it would go fast, and my goodness hasn't it. Well, we're going to sum up this week. Chapter 9 is kind of the culmination of everything we've been building towards, though it continues in many ways to also be an extension of that Chapter 8 fragmentation we were talking about. Composers going off with tons of different directions, and honestly, each composition sometimes is the composer kind of literally reinventing themselves. There's a great quote at the start of the chapter: "There is no such thing as dissonance. It is only an extreme form of consonance." Arnold Schoenberg, the guy you met in the last chapter. Well, due respect to Dr. Schoenberg, I can't say that I'd completely agree with that. Some of this music is really harsh. It's really dissonant, but with a purpose. These composers were exploring the outer fringes of what quote-unquote classical music could be, and some of it's tough. There's no way around it, but it's also pretty fascinating. The more you delve into it, the deeper you see in these modern compositions. Admittedly, not for everybody's taste. If you like Chopin, this will be a little more challenging for you, but historically it's interesting, and it is, of course, very important. We start with some classic FM links, just like before, and we start with John Cage, arguably the most famous of the modernist composers, the guy that leads us to chance music, to indeterminacy. Now here again, here's a guy like Schoenberg, like the others in Chapter 8, heavily classically trained. He has all the chops, he has all the skills to write what we would call conventional music, but he makes some very conscious artistic choices. First, to write for chamber ensembles like percussion ensemble, which we hadn't seen before, to try other new elements in chamber music. And then when that wasn't enough, he tries to incorporate the percussion sound into the piano, and he creates a prepared piano, a piano with nuts and bolts and all kind of little things shoved into it. That's the Perilous Night, the listening guide that you have here, and there's Bacchanal, there's many other famous ones. Then he goes into an onchoic chamber. This is a completely soundproof chamber, and he wanted to hear what total silence sounded like. When he got in there, he could hear a very high-pitched whine, which he said was the synapses in his body, the electrical pulses firing, and he could, of course, hear his heartbeat, tum, 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 which had pitch and rhythm. And he began to theorize that there's no such thing as silence. And if there's no such thing as silence, then everything that has pitch, duration, tone is and can be considered music. And he began writing chance element music with those basic tenets in mind. We've got a great conversation here between John Cage and the music critic Tim Page. I talked with Tim Page about this a little bit. He said, it's interesting to read, but it doesn't really do it justice. To really get it, you've got to hear it, because this was a radio program. Cage was getting pretty upset. So as you read John Cage's words here, kind of read them with some intensity in his voice, because he was getting a little bent out of shape by the time he got, particularly toward the end of this interview. And then you've got an indeterminate piece. You've got a chance piece. It's a very short excerpt from a much longer piece, 30 pieces for 5 orchestras, and you can read about it and how it's laid out. It's pretty fascinating. And then people build on what Cage did. One of my favorites is George Crumb. George Crumb, to me, brings romantic elements, a sense of humor that we don't... there's humor in Cage, to be sure, but it's different in George Crumb. You have one of his most famous works, Ancient Voices of Children. He combined with the great Janda Gaetani, a singer, explored the outer reaches of what the human voice could do. You've got two movements here. The third movement, the Sacred Life Cycle movement, and then each afternoon in Granada a child dies. Each afternoon is kind of this palindrome piece. You actually have the printed music here. Now, even if you don't read music, just look at this and see. It's almost a work of art. The meticulousness with which he writes these notations, that's to bring out all the nuance that Janda Gaetani had in her voice. But at the same time, you have chance elements. So you've got these meticulously notated events, but see the sacred life cycle and see how this leads to this, and then when this happens, then you go over here, and if this happens, you go over here. The performers make the determination about exactly how the final version of the piece comes down, and it happens differently in every performance. And then in the fourth movement, this beautiful little, very tragic poem set to music. Each afternoon in Granada, a child dies each afternoon. You can see the palindromic nature of that. He writes this really haunting marimba part with voices, and then he uses If Thou Be Near, this beautiful little tune from the Ana Magdalena songbook by J.S. Bach. And he has it played on a child's toy piano. It's very creepy, kind of haunting. He plays the whole thing up to the very last chord. So we hear that dominant chord, but it never resolves to tonic. It remains incomplete in the performance. And it is this palindromic nature of every afternoon this happens, every afternoon this happens, every afternoon, blah, blah, blah. Crumb's fascinating. Check him out. Edgar Varese, nothing will prepare you for this, but he's a trippy dude. Really interesting stuff. Check him out. Olivier Messiaen incorporates bird songs. Again, there's meticulous notation, but there's also a lot of freedom in his music. Absolutely fascinating. His Quartet for the End of Time was written in a Nazi concentration camp. It's one of the most powerful pieces of chamber music you'll ever hear. Pierre Boulez, here's where we start the total serialist movement. You see the term here. Total serialism was building on what Schoenberg did, but now we're not just serializing the sequence of notes. We can serialize pitch, duration, rhythm, what instruments are used. Any and all parameters can be done that way. Boulez, of course, also goes on to be a very important conductor. Some of you have already seen him conduct some of the Wagner stuff you guys watched back in Chapter 6. Boulez was conducting. He conducted the New York Philharmonic for a long time. For an important composer, important conductor as well. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Here's a guy who tries a little bit of everything. This, again, is where, like I say, they keep reinventing themselves. Stockhausen did total serialism. Stockhausen did total chance. He did a piece called Starklangen Lied. Go out in a park at night, look up at the stars, treat it as sheet music and play it. Whatever you see in the stars, that's what you play. I can't make that stuff up. A 7-day opera, you can read all about it. It's fascinating stuff. Milton Babbitt, the most academic of the academic composers. Fascinating cat. Really totally embraced this idea of total serialism to the point where he actually would take all the parameters of a given piece, plug it on punch cards, old school punch cards, put it into a room-sized computer that has less computing power than your cell phone, but he would have the computer actually spit out the completed piece of music. So now we're doing that, which is pretty fascinating. You can read all about it. The controversial article, Who Cares If You Listen, addresses some of the issues about classical music and how modern classical music was diverging from the audience. Georg Ligeti is a fascinating guy. All kinds of different chance music. Some minimalistic elements, though we don't really call him a minimalist composer. He's just a fascinating guy. Every piece, again, reinvents itself. If you're a movie fan, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, a lot of Ligeti's music was used in that film. It's quite famous. And then we get into the true minimalist, Philip Glass, and kind of his cohort at the time, Steve Reich, though they eventually had a falling out. Both fascinating guys. And the guy we talk of as sort of a post-minimalist, if you will, John Adams. Adams, of course, goes on to write albums like Nixon in China, and probably one of his most famous recently is Dr. Atomic, which of course is critical implications here in New Mexico. It talks about the Trinity Site test and what went on at the Los Alamos labs and Dr. Oppenheimer and all of that. It's pretty fascinating stuff. You have Feel for Symmetries. Again, this is an excerpt. This is not the complete piece. I would encourage you to go elsewhere on the internet and discover some of his full pieces. They're much bigger. And then we get into the people I call eclectics, and some people like to call them polystylists. This to me is kind of the wave of the musical future. And I'll be adding more of these type composers in the next edition of the book. People like Tan Dunn, John Corigliano. I mentioned some of them here, but I don't spend a lot of time with them, unfortunately. Ellen Zwilich is one of my favorites. She's the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for Classical Music. Her Symphony No. 1. You have a link here. Again, Tim Page. This is a lot more friendly interview, and he paints a nice portrait of her and her life. You have her Concerto for Trombone, which I think speaks to so many different things. You can read about it. Excuse my scrolling. You can read about it here in the writing, in the prompt that leads up to it, and the discussion of the listening guide. It's a fantastic piece. I recommend it to you highly. And we finish the chapter with one of the guys I see as the future of classical music, blending pop music with classical music. Guys like Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was, of course, a rock and roll icon, genius, although some people today find his rock and roll music even a little challenging compared to the pop music we have today. But he's a fascinating dude. If you don't know him, I encourage you to discover his pop music first and then check some of this out. You have an excerpt here from his autobiography, and it talks about how academia has become the new patron of the arts and how people in academic circles are sometimes writing music that people just don't want to hear, and he addresses that here. Zappa had some strong language, and he was also a very strong proponent against censorship in the arts, and so I didn't censor him here, so brace yourself. There's a couple of dirty words. It's college. I'm sure you can deal with it. I love that the family gave us all his doodles. I think that that's really cool. You also have a section here that's just woefully inadequate, but if you're interested in any of this music, Sam Barber, Leonard Bernstein, John Corigliano I mentioned, David Del Tredici is fascinating, David Diamond, one of my favorites from the 20th century, Roy Harris, great Americana composer. There's so many. Thea Musgrave, Pauline Ontiveros, we're seeing more and more female composers take an important role in modern classical music. And there are really some really cool folks there. William Schumann had a Juilliard for many, many years. Joan Tower, Fanfare for the Uncommon Woman. There's actually 6 of them, which is really cool. So let me get through the study guide here. And the next section is a little interlude that's going to deal with issues in the arts today, what's going on with the world. We start with a long excerpt from Mike Walsh's book, Who's Afraid of Classical Music, that talks about modern composers, and again, this divergence between the audience and the composer. And he addresses it very well with one exception, and it's the exception that I feel most strongly about. It is education in the modern world. How can we expect people to enjoy, explore, get into this music if we don't teach them anything about it? We've taken arts out of the schools. We've taken arts education out of, for many of you in this class, this is your first experience with classical music. Well, it's wonderful, and I'm glad you're here, and I hope you enjoyed some of it, but it's too late. It's too late. You should have gotten this information in 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th grade. You should have had better access to arts education there. And how do we expect voters to make a decision if they don't know anything about this stuff? And, let's throw this out. You can read all about it. You can read about the National Endowment for the Arts. It's pretty fascinating. You're going to have an essay question from this material, and you'll see that in the writing prompt in between chapters 9 and 10. And then finally, we have jazz. Jazz, America's classical music. This is a term from Dr. Billy Taylor, and I think it's quite relevant, particularly today. We're in the middle of some pretty big political and social upheaval protests going on right now, and jazz is an integral part of that discussion. I've been seeing a lot of pieces lately on the news where they're using background music. They don't acknowledge it, but it is historically critical. It's John Coltrane. It is Charles Mingus. It is all these amazing musicians who were making social political statements, particularly in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. These were groundbreaking guys that are all discussed here. Now, everything we've done in the first 9 chapters with classical music is even more compressed here. It's teeny tiny. You're just getting the scratch the surface overview. But you'll see that all of this introductory stuff, the minstrel shows to ragtime, leads us to New Orleans, leads us to traditional jazz, which takes us to swing, which takes us to bebop. And again, here comes that fragmentation. The music just splinters after that, and we get cool school and hard bop and this free jazz stuff. And then we start using electric instruments and bringing in funk and fusion elements and soul music elements. And Miles Davis does this album, Bitches Brew, and it just changes the world forever. It's all here. The weakest part is the last part, these recent trends. Music is changing so quickly and so dramatically now, but there's a lot of great stuff to discover, and I encourage you to do that. Unlike the other chapters, there are listening guides here. They do not link to anything on the Kindle Hunt website. Instead, I've given you Spotify links, which will open in a new window. If you have Spotify, you can listen to these things. If you don't, you can get a little 30-minute snippet, or you can whatever. There's tons of other ways to access this information. So if you don't have Spotify, try Napster, try Slacker, try Last.fm. You can go on YouTube and discover a lot of this. And of course, there's tons of great video stuff too. You can find access to this material or similar for everything we've got for these examples. So there's tons of stuff for you to listen to. This is just the start. Enjoy. Have a great last week.